The best of money matters. Under the radar.
You're tuning in to Money FM 89.3, and it's now time for a special on-the-go episode of Under the Radar with me, Chua Tian Tian, where we bring you on-the-ground reports of key business events, launches, features, or developers' days. Now, this time, the leadership of enterprise identity security firm SailPoint is in Singapore for a business trip, and I headed downtown to meet with the team to find out what's brewing for the firm. But first, who is SailPoint and what exactly is identity security? Well, founded in 2005, SailPoint delivers innovative solutions that address what it describes as some of the world's most dynamic security issues. In particular, the company focuses on identity security by automating and streamlining the complexity of delivering the right access to the right identities at the right time. Now, it might sound like a mouthful, but think of SailPoint as a security guard that ensures only the right personnel enter the right office buildings and gain access only to the information that they are authorized to hold, except that in this case, SailPoint manages and grants access to enterprise applications and data automatically at speed and at scale. Now, with a presence in over 60 countries and a team of over 2,600 employees, SailPoint serves some of the biggest enterprises in the world, ranging from automaker General Motors to chocolate manufacturer Hershey. And SailPoint is an interesting company to talk about, given how it raised $1.38 billion in its upsized IPO on the Nasdaq in February 2025, the first major tech listing of 2025. Now, this is not the first time that the firm has gone public. It first did so back in 2017, 3 years after being acquired by private equity firm Thoma Bravo. And the story gets more interesting from here because Thoma Bravo bought the company back again in its second acquisition after SailPoint's first IPO. So what was the rationale behind the second IPO, and how is SailPoint faring in the months since going public again? Meanwhile, SailPoint said the company is setting its sights on Singapore and Asia Pacific at a time when demand for advanced AI-driven identity security solutions is surging. But what are the specific opportunities present in the region, and what are some major investments by the firm in the region then? Well, for more, let's speak to Mark McLean, CEO of SailPoint. All right, and Mark, we've briefly talked about SailPoint as an enterprise identity security firm that automates and streamlines the complexity of delivering the right access to the right identities at the right time. A lot of jargon to sort of go through, but I understand an easy way to understand is that SailPoint acts like a security guard that ensures that only the right personnel enter the right office buildings and access the right information, except that in this case, you're managing and granting access to enterprise applications and data automatically at speed and at scale. So take us through SailPoint's value proposition and business model right now.
Thank you, Tian Tian. It's a pleasure to be with you today. There's a couple of things that have been historically the focus of what SailPoint does. The two big common terms in our space are lifecycle management, which anyone who's joined a business understands this. There's a very common phraseology: joiner, mover, leaver, right? We join an organization, we sometimes move around into different jobs, and then we leave. And when those happen in a business, usually that means the person joining the organization has a certain role or job function, and that means they have access to certain applications, access to certain data, and then if they get promoted, they transfer, that might change, and then someday they may leave the organization, and then we cut off all of their access. That's how it's supposed to work. In reality, sometimes it's a little messier than that. And that's become a little bit of a challenge today, because when we don't have those things correct, we all know that many of the attackers, people that are trying to compromise our enterprises, they often attack that identity. They're trying to, through phishing, for instance, get your identity, and then if they can get your identity and your password, they will try to access those systems. So we want to make sure people have access to the minimum, it's called minimum required access, that they need to do their job, so that if there ever is a compromise, that attacker doesn't have too much. So we're always looking to have kind of just the right amount. You have the access you need to do your job and nothing extra. The other big function of SailPoint historically, and I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe where we're going, but historically has been a concept of compliance or audit. And the thought there is that on some basis, maybe once a quarter, once a year, managers, owners of data or applications in a business are asked to certify or audit that the right people are still, in fact, the right people accessing their systems. So again, if someone, back to our joiner, mover, leaver, if someone moved away to a different group, but no one ever took away that access, we catch that in an audit and say, oh, we should have turned that off, now let's turn it off. So those simple functions of lifecycle and audit have been the historical focus of what SailPoint does for very large organizations around the world.
If we look at products and services in terms of verticals, Mark, I understand SailPoint solutions can be largely split into 3 verticals. One is core solutions, which revolve around identity and security cloud. The second being advanced capabilities ranging from cloud infrastructure, entitlement management, and machine identity security. The third being connectivity and integrations. Once again, a lot of jargon to go through, but what are the use cases under each vertical? Which is the most important vertical for you when it comes down to money on your balance sheet?
Yeah, in some ways, I'll jump around a little, I suppose. The first and the third are highly related, because if we're going to come in with our core offerings, as we just mentioned, lifecycle and compliance, that means we have to connect to typically hundreds, sometimes thousands of systems in a very large enterprise. And so we have to have the connectivity, which means either it's a known application like Salesforce or Workday or ServiceNow, very common business applications, or in most all of our customers, they have bespoke or custom built applications, very common in financial for services, for instance, where they've built their own applications. Well, to manage, say, your access across all of that environment, we build connectors to those known business applications, and then we have to have the capability to come in and connect to a unique application or bunch of unique applications in the customer environment. So the connectivity allows us to gather that information, to get visibility of all that access, and then to map it into those compliance and lifecycle processes. The other, as you mentioned, are kind of specialized needs that most customers often want, but not necessarily every customer. So we call those separate, call those out separately. The bulk of our business today is in those 2 buckets of connectivity and compliance and lifecycle. What is shifting, I think, in our world a bit is that these things were typically done just to help the business operate smoothly and efficiently. You know, when you join a company, you want to get to work as quickly as possible. If you transfer, you want to get to your new job as quickly as possible and do your work. But today, it's not just to how well we can set things up correctly so people can do their work. We also know that now most of the attackers, nation states, criminals, they are trying to attack identities so they can get into the organization and get to the data. So now there's sort of a business use operation that we help provide, but also protecting the organization's data. That's becoming a much more significant interest, and that's where things like machine identity that you mentioned are more important. We're trying to make sure bad actors can't compromise a machine or a software bot or an intelligent device, even though there's no human in that loop. They don't want to compromise that device and then get to the data again. Their goal is always to get to our important data. And we're trying to protect the organization's information from the bad actors.
Let's talk about customers. Your customers include some of the biggest enterprises in the world. We are talking about automakers like General Motors. We're talking about chocolate makers like Hershey. How would you segment your customers then? What are the services or the use cases they demand from you? Is it homogeneous in general? Which is the most important customer segment? What is the average deal size we are looking at?
Okay, boy, there's a few questions wrapped in. Let me try to get to all of them.
Quite a number of them.
Okay, so we're what's called a very horizontal offering, meaning if you think of, say, a product or service that was very specific to one industry, healthcare or manufacturing, what SailPoint does is very universally applicable to any large-scale enterprise, right? And that means, in general, we serve every vertical, and mostly large, very large, down to, say, mid-sized companies. Now, that term mid-size can vary around the world. So usually that means down to a few thousand employees is typically where we limit our low end of our market, up to the largest organizations in the world. A couple of statistics that are usually interesting. We have about 1/2 of the Fortune 500 in the US and about 1/4 of the global 2,000. The largest 2,000 companies in the world, about 25% around the world are SailPoint customers. So we are known for providing very high levels of service and capability for the biggest, most complex businesses in the world. That was your vertical. And to your question, there are some, I would call them nuances by industry. The basic services we provide are pretty common, but in certain industries, let me give you a couple examples. You mentioned automaker, right? One of the things that's true of a classic automaker is a relatively smaller proportion of their identities are their own employees. Because you think of an auto company, they have two big connections. One is their dealer network, hundreds or maybe thousands of people in their dealer network that don't work for the automaker. On the other side, they have a supply chain that's huge. And so they often have hundreds or thousands of people that work for those suppliers, but both of the suppliers and the dealers need access to their systems. So SailPoint has to not just manage all the employees of a big automaker, they have to manage that supply chain and those distributors, dealers, as they also try to access those systems. That's maybe unique to that industry. Another uniqueness, here's a very interesting one that happens in the healthcare environment. Quite often, a single person may have multiple relationships with a healthcare environment. Here's what I mean. You can be a doctor and be providing the service in a hospital. You can get sick and come to that hospital as a patient. Now you have a different relationship. It can be a teaching hospital. Well, now you're a professor in an educational environment. You're the same human, but you have different, we call personas, different relationships with that business. So again, these are nuances by industry. But in general, across all industries, you have these processes of allowing people access to what they need, making sure it stays accurate as they change, and then taking it away when they leave. What's really interesting about this space, Tian Tian, is that now companies are caring not only about the humans, which has been our focus for most of our existence, but there's this concept of non-human identities. So maybe we want to talk about that a little bit.
We will definitely talk more about that because I believe AI is on the agenda later on. But let's talk about your presence in terms of geographies because your employees, 2,600 of them are dotted around the world. You have a presence in over 60 markets. Which are the major income generating market and what is the role of APAC and Singapore in this regard? Yeah,
in general, like a lot of US originated companies, you know, the North American market is our largest market, and it's gotten pretty significant over our history. But it's, as you would expect, as it's gained in scale, it's become a little bit slower growing. And in Europe and Middle East, Africa, we call that market EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa. It's the second largest and a little faster growing than North America. And not surprisingly, Asia Pacific, the smallest market today, the fastest growing. So we, over time, have extended around the world. And what we find is, what's interesting about Asia, particularly the broad APJ, we call it now because it includes Japan. Sometimes people keep Japan separate. We've now incorporated it together. What's amazing about this market is such an incredible diversity across the region. Not only great geographic diversity, these countries are very far apart. Some people think they're going to fly to Asia and like, oh, I'll go visit Japan and Korea and Singapore and Australia. That's like 3 days of flying. So it's not quite as easy to multiple countries. But there's also tremendous diversity in kind of the sophistication. As you know, there's been a tremendous movement in technology to SaaS, software as a service. Well, some of these countries were very early adopters of SaaS, some much more recent. We also find in general that their view of security or regulation can vary. So many factors can cause variation, but in general, what we are very confident in that the needs that SailPoint addresses, this idea of more efficiency and automation, but also protection of those identities and data, that is a global need. And the big companies, particularly in this market, big and mid-size, as I said, they find that they have the same struggles as companies in Europe versus companies in America. So in general, we're finding very high receptivity in this market. Our headquarters is here in Singapore. That's where we kind of run APJ out of. But as you said, we're fortunate to have people serving us from all the way up at, northern Japan, all the way down to Australia, and basically all the major economies in between.
And we must talk about your recent Nasdaq IPO, Mark, which raised $1.38 billion for the firm. Now, SailPoint's IPO on the US Nasdaq, that marks the first major tech listing of 2025. But what is interesting here is that this is not the first time that the firm has gone public. It first did so in 2017, 3 years after being acquired by PE firm Thoma Bravo. And the plot thickens, if you will, because Thoma Bravo bought the company back again in a second acquisition post first IPO. So what was the rationale behind taking SailPoint public once again? Do you think valuations are right now?
Boy, it's such an interesting story, as you said, Tian Tian. I found out recently there's a very small number of CEO founders who have done this. Two that are notable. I'm in an interesting club, Richard Branson and Michael Dell. So I think the three of us will go have dinner and talk about two IPOs. But I'm just kidding about that. But I think in general, what we've done always is focus the company on two big ideas. One is we want to build a great culture so we can attract very fantastic employees so they can take great care of our customers. I think it all starts with if you do a fine job with your employees, hire and attract great people and make a great environment for them to work, they will often deliver great things for your customers. But the other is we've continued to kind of pursue what the market needs us to do, and that's led to a lot of interesting growth over the years. And the financial backing of the company has, as you said, gone through a very interesting trajectory, very uncommon. We were venture capital, then we were private equity, then we were first IPO, back to the private equity, back to the IPO. Yes, I say if you want to take a negative view, I'm just schizophrenic and I just can't make up my mind, but I don't think that's it. At the end of the day, we continue to look for what is the right financial profile of the business and what does the business need. Capital is fundamentally fuel for growing a business, right? And if you're going to grow a business at high speed, often you need fuel from the outside to grow that business. Early on, we took venture capital to help get the company off the ground. We got to a certain scale and we felt like a private equity partner would enable us to tighten up our operations and get very efficient, which we did, which led to our first IPO. Then the markets were pretty choppy in 21 and 22. And because we had a history with that private equity firm, we said, maybe we'll come off the market, do some other changes. Sometimes it's easier to make significant changes in a business when you're not in a public market setting. We changed our fiscal year end. We took a lot of focus on adding new technology to our business. And we actually changed our auditors. Turns out that's a hard thing to do and it's easier to do when you're private. And so in retrospect, doing all that as a private company for a few years set us up in a very good position to come back to the public markets. Now, as you said, Tian Tian, interesting year it's been, hasn't it? We went public early on in 2025.
Yes.
And then we had Liberation Day, as it's called in America. And that created an interesting set of dynamics. So the markets have been a little choppier as a result of some of the economic and tariff information out in the markets. We've been fortunate to continue to grow the business at a healthy rate. Sometimes stock markets, though, are much more reactive to the surrounding environment than what any individual business is doing. SailPoint has actually performed quite well against expectations. Our stock price doesn't probably fully reflect that because it's also subject to the entire market conditions. But we feel very confident that if we continue to deliver great results into the future, as we have in our first few quarters as a public company, ultimately we will see good pricing in the stock market. Today, I think we're okay with where it is based on the market around us. But in general, our focus is less on what's happening around us than what we can control. I'll give you a quick little anecdote. When we went public the first time, I had a lot of employees that were very nervous about the stock price. And I said, look, every second you spend watching the stock price, you're doing nothing to help the stock price, right? If you're watching the stock price on your computer, you're not doing your work. Like, we will worry about the stock price as senior executives. You do your work, build software, sell to customers, take care of customers, market, all the things we do. And most of us, that's what we do 99% of every day. The stock market will ultimately, I think, reflect value correctly if you build a healthy growth, profitable business over time, and that's what we're building.
You talked about how employees can actually focus or use their time better on improving the business than setting their sights on the market value. But if I could digress a little, how would you describe SailPoint's relationship with Thoma Bravo? Is it that big brother that is helping you keep an eye on your perceived and actual market value then, instead of your employees?
So we know Big Brother has a couple different connotations. There's the kind that was in Brave New World and 1984, which isn't good. And then there's the kind that if you're a little kid, you want your big brother to protect you from the bullies. I think what they've been is actually neither of those, but in some ways a very good, healthy financial partner. What Thoma Bravo is exceptionally good at as a firm is they look at a lot of software businesses across the landscape. And it's almost like a great mechanic with cars. They understand what makes a car work exceptionally well in the engine, in the suspension, and everything that makes a car perform well. Like think of an F1 mechanic, right? Well, they've learned how to help software companies get very focused on what parts of their software business, their car, need to be tuned up. And so when we've been with them both times, after the first before the first IPO, and then after the take private up to this newer IPO, we found that they're a good partner to help us identify places we really need to focus to drive value. They don't try to help us determine what's the best part of the market to focus on. They trust that our leadership team, our management team understands what's happening in our market, what the products and services are that are going to be most helpful and valuable in the market. So they don't dictate product strategy to us. They do help us with a financial picture of what the business should look like. And because we did a really good job of that, frankly, while we were private, we came back to the public markets probably a year faster than most people thought we would. So I think it's a testament to their good advice and counsel on kind of the financial profile of the business, while we continue to focus on the market, the competition, the solutions we're providing, and that's what we're expert at.
I was just tuning in when I'm in conversation with Mark McLean, CEO of SailPoint. And Mark, let's zoom in on where things are at for the firm post-IPO. So in June 2025, that's when you reported your results. Total annual recurring revenue, ARR, stands at $925 million for Q1 fiscal 2026, an increase of 30% from the level we saw a year ago. But if we look at GAAP operating loss, that came in at $185 million for Q1, as compared to around $68 million in the year ago period. So how would you assess the firm's latest performance in terms of the widening of operating loss despite an increase in revenue?
Yeah, that is unfortunately a more technical answer, so I'll try to be not too complex here, and let me explain what I mean. One of the things that's unique about the software industry is how our accounting regulations in the US have us account for what's called stock-based compensation. So one of the things that does is it puts tremendous pressure on your GAAP reported losses. Most investors, those people that are investing from the public markets in software, they look at what's called non-GAAP, believe it or not. There's an official term, non-GAAP operating income, where they ignore those hits on the balance sheet, on the income statement, that are not really reflecting the business. If you think of the business as we're driving revenue by selling products, and then we're delivering by all the expenses, right? Our software team, our sales team. So then they often look at free cash flow and what's called non-GAAP operating income. Both of those measures actually improved pretty dramatically. The degradation, so to speak, of GAAP was mostly driven by how we have to report as a public company stock-based compensation. So it is a very common reaction to people that don't always follow the software industry super closely in America. This, I think, is a uniquely American thing with how we report. But in many ways, we try to assure people the fact that our stock has done well is a reflection that the investors understand this, and they know to focus on non-GAAP operating income and free cash flow. We have to pay attention to GAAP, but we actually don't get tracked as close to GAAP as you might think. They're looking at those other two measures as a true measure of the health of the business.
And if we set our sights on the future, Mark, what are the key drivers of growth in the longer term in the age of generative AI? I mean, how is generative AI changing up the security risks faced by enterprises? And do you expect to see this great reshuffle in the landscape as players sort of try to get a grasp of what cybersecurity in the age of Gen AI would mean?
You ask incredibly good multi-part questions. So I'll try to answer multi-part question. Okay, so on the first hand, yes, there's probably been, and I've been in the technology industry for, I hesitate to say this, 40 years this year. So I started as a young child. No, I'm just kidding. But it's been 4 decades for me in the technology industry. And I think it's fair to say most people of my vintage would say we've never seen something quite so dramatic as Gen AI. I mean, I lived through the introduction of the personal computer, the introduction of the cell phone, the internet, SaaS. Like, I've seen a lot of interesting technology shifts, but this has been unbelievable. You've probably seen that chart, Tian Tian. Someone mapped the time it took to get to 1 million users for various technologies. The internet was number of years, cell phones number of years. I think for social media, it was a number of months. For Gen AI, it was 2 weeks. Like, we've never seen an adoption curve like that ever. And so what every business is wrestling with is two things. This technology, AI has been around a while, but Gen AI is newer, right? This technology has the potential to change a lot of ways we do business and the efficiency with which we can do it, maybe unlike anything ever. And, big and, it also represents a significant risk that's new. Because as we've been talking, right, for a while now, I call it the attack vector of choice, right? Hackers, bad actors, right? We still have firewalls, for instance. We try to protect the bad guys from breaking through the firewall, but today, they don't necessarily try to break through the firewall. They try to get you to give up your email and your password in a phishing attempt. Then they break in with your password, and then they move around to try to access other data. So people have seen identity as a major attack focus for a while now. Well, this new capability with AI is leading to something called agentic or AI agents, where you're going to have these little pieces of technology that run around and ask questions and return answers back to people so they can do their job better. Well, what everybody has seen already is these agents are very powerful. They can accelerate the business. They can give you new insights, but they are another place that the bad actors can attack. So what we're feeling is this tension in the market where companies are very anxious, the business leaders, very anxious to implement these technologies and accelerate the business. And the security people are quite concerned about how to control it. There's an old phrase in our security business that you'll relate to here in Singapore, like we do in Austin, where I'm from, Austin, Texas. We both have F1 tracks. We both knew Formula One. There's an old adage that says, why do race cars have brakes? The answer is so they can go really fast, right? If you're a race car and you're trying to go fast, you have to trust your brakes so that you can navigate through turns, slow down rapidly, and then accelerate rapidly, right? Great brakes and great engines lead to a great race car and a great driver, of course. Well, what the industry is saying is AI, Gen AI, may be the fastest engine we've ever seen. Tremendous potential for speed, but you need great brakes so you can control that powerful technology and not get into trouble. SailPoint represents one of the important brakes. Like, we need to help people implement this technology rapidly but safely. And I think that's where we're seeing much opportunity coming from in the next few years is companies are anxious to implement technology like this, and they also want to protect their information, protect their data. And that tension is something that we are going to be able to help a lot of customers navigate in the coming years.
So in that regard, how are you positioning for the opportunities that will arise? So what kind of brakes are you building right now?
Lots of different kinds, actually. The truth is AI is so new and evolving so rapidly. We, like many companies, are trying lots of things. I think one of the things we know it's going to be very good at is looking for patterns in the data and helping us see when there's an anomaly. One of the hardest things about security in general, by the way, is to see when the normal patterns change, because that's usually an indicator that something bad has happened. You could be working in a company and have a normal pattern of accessing your data, and all of a sudden one day you're doing something very different. You're downloading lots of data, or you're trying to log into new systems. When security teams see that, they're like, something is going on here, right? Either Tian Tian has decided to do something bad, or more likely somebody has compromised Tian Tian, and that's not even Tian Tian doing that, that's a bad person impersonating Tian Tian. Well, the ability to see patterns in the huge amount of things happening in an enterprise is pretty difficult today. One of the things we'll use AI for is to help look through all those sources of activity and find patterns that look like bad actors. But the other thing we think we'll do, a lot of companies are using AI for, is just to make these very complex environments easier to navigate. Sometimes today it's very difficult to even understand, based on your organizational position, what exactly should you have access to? And are you in some unique situation where you need to have normal access like everyone else in your role, but something different because you're on a special project, for instance, right? Well, getting that accurate is so difficult in these big organizations. So we think AI is going to help normal business people say, I'm trying to understand how my new employees' access should be set up, given that they're doing this, but not this. Oh, and this, right? That's very difficult to do in natural language. So we think natural language asking simple questions, returning complex data to very simple questions is one of the big ways AI will help our customers.
Specific to Asia Pacific, Mark, that leads me to my next question actually, because with the IPO, SailPoint said it is setting its sights on Singapore and APAC because it is seeing surging demand for advanced AI-driven identity security solutions.
That's correct.
So specific to APAC, what are the key opportunities and what are some of the key investments made in this regard?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's not going to be dramatically different across the region, as we said, but there are, like I said, countries and even industries in those countries on different aspects of their journey. I think Singapore is a pretty advanced technology environment. Australia, very advanced technology environment. I'll point to another part of the region, Japan, which has had a lot of economic challenges for the last few decades. It's kind of coming back out of that. So we see Japan actually being a little further behind today in their adoption of some of these technologies, but they're a very big economy with a lot of potential to grow quickly. So we see different profiles like this around the region. In general, we think all over the world, there's going to be this pressure in mid to large businesses to adopt AI to be competitive. So that's going to be pretty common. There are things that vary around the world in terms of data. Some countries have regulations that their data must stay in their country relative to their customers. So we have to navigate regulatory environments, traditions within industries, and then the adoption of technology that varies. But with that all said, we think in general, Singapore, much of the rest of ASEAN, and everything, again, back to pretty advanced markets in Australia to kind of relatively earlier developing markets in Korea and Japan, all represent tremendous opportunity, and we're really putting a lot of focus across the region.
And before I let you go, Mark, keep us excited. What are some of the investments you have committed to the Singapore market, and really what are some future plans for APAC and for Singapore?
I should have gotten an exact statistic, but I believe that our team has roughly tripled here in the last few years. So I think that's certainly an indicator that we're putting a lot more people on the ground here to add more sales people, services people, customer care people, technology people that are really helping customers on their day-to-day journey. We're a global business, so we're going to support these companies in this region with teams around the world, because they often operate globally around the world. I was talking to a few customers here in Singapore this morning, and they operate all over Europe and all over Asia. Some of them operate even in the US as well. So just like when we're dealing with US companies that operate globally, we're often dealing with companies in APAC that operate well outside of this region. And so they expect that kind of high caliber, high quality technology support. And again, what we do is very critical, and so they expect us to guide them and help them to address these very complex solutions. We think we have to do that as well as anyone in the industry, and we're fortunate to find tremendous talent in this region. Very proud of the talent we have here in Singapore and around the region, and we think we're set up very well to grow with the industry and grow with the market here in Asia.
Thanks so much for the insights today, Mark. That was Mark McLean, CEO at SailPoint. Thank you so much for joining us on Money FM 89.3.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
And this is an on-the-go special episode of Under the Radar with me, Chua Tian Tian.
Before acting on the information on Money FM, please consider if it's suitable for your own investment objectives, financial situation, and risk tolerance. To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.